In a recent video, we looked at USS Canberra, a ship best known for her excellent gunfire support off the coast of Vietnam. Canberra was in high demand as one of the final gun cruisers, with an excellent gun crew who were incredibly good at their job. Today we'll be looking to one of her sisters, and another ship known for shore bombardment duty after the Second World War. In this case, USS Saint Paul. Unlike Canberra, she remained a standard Baltimore her entire life. In fact, she would be the last of the type in service. No missile conversions here. And because of that, she had the full gun battery to put to use off both Korea and Vietnam, where she was just as effective as Canberra, but with a twist. A very long-range twist. She also got to be a movie star related to the other American cruiser I covered recently, USS Salt Lake City. That said, all of this came pretty late in the ship's career. As you could expect, being a Baltimore, that story started much earlier, at the height of the Second World War, when a new cruiser was first laid down. That came on February 3rd, 1943, at the Bethlehem Yard in Quincy, Massachusetts. At the time, the new ship was to be named Rochester. As near as I can tell, the name was changed to St. Paul because of another name change. That being the original St. Paul becoming USS Quincy CA-71, forcing the Navy to shift around the names. Regardless, this ship was one of 14 Baltimore-class cruisers, the first American heavy cruisers to be built free of tonnage restrictions. Now, I've covered a couple of these ships already, Pittsburgh and the aforementioned Canberra, so I won't linger long on the design details this time around. Let's start with the displacement as usual. In this case, a full load of around 17,300 tons. On that tonnage, the ship carried the standard American heavy cruiser layout. 3 triple turrets and 9 8-inch 203mm guns. On the other hand, the secondary battery would be increased to 12 5-inch 127mm guns and 6 twin mounts, 2 on either broadside, with the remaining pair carried on the centerline. Weaponry was rounded off at this point by the traditional American loadout, around 24 20mm cannon and 48 40mm Bofors. With that finishing off the weaponry, it's time for the armor and the speed. When it comes to armor, this was 4 to 6 inches, 102 to 152 millimeters on the main belt, with 2.5 inches, 64 millimeters for the deck, while the speed came out to 33 knots on 120,000 shaft horsepower. And this wraps up the design details for the most part. There were some modifications made to the lighter weaponry later on in her service, but nothing like what Canberra received. So, with that in mind, let's get to that service. As noted, St. Paul was laid down on February 3rd, 1943. She would then be launched on September 16th, 1944, and commissioned on February 17th, 1945. Very late into the Second World War, to say the least. Considering the fact she was on sea trials and training until July, that's even more true. St. Paul's service in the Pacific War would be short and abbreviated. Although this isn't to say that she did nothing in that conflict, even if what she did do was largely late war American cruiser things, namely sailing to escort the fast carriers on July 2nd, 1945, when those ships set off to assault the Japanese home islands. By this point of the war, there was very little Japan could do to stop that kind of assault. Even the kamikazes were becoming less effective. Those that did attack the ship, and Saint Paul would have to fend off some large attacks, failed to damage the cruiser, though that was partially down to holding them back for the expected invasion of Japan. In any case, Saint Paul would cover the carriers during their raids on Kure and Tokyo, with a side of bombarding targets herself. The fact that even cruisers could shoot up targets in Japan itself says a lot, as does the fact that Saint Paul fired her final salvo on August 9th, one of the final ships to bombard Japan. You'll often see her listed as the last ship to bombard Japan. Less than a week later, on the 15th, the Japanese would surrender, although the formal surrender ceremony only came on September 2nd in Tokyo Bay. Saint Paul would be one of many Allied warships present that day. When that concluded, the cruiser remained in Japanese waters through September and October to support the occupation, including sending men ashore in and around Tokyo to disarm the Japanese defenders. This would only conclude on November 5th, when Saint Paul was sent off to Shanghai, somewhere she would remain as an American presence in China through to early 1946, a revival of the old river patrol. This was, for the most part, uneventful. However, not entirely. In fact, there was a minor collision on December 21st, 1945. This is covered by an article in Warship International that I'll link in the description. An ex-Japanese landing craft under Chinese control hit St. Paul's bow. Currents had pushed the landing craft along, and the crew couldn't stop it in time, leading to severe damage to the Chinese vessel, but only minor damage to St. Paul. Specifically, according to the ship's log, a bow plate punctured for about 2.5 feet on the port side waterline. Still enough damage to require sailing to California for repair work. The cruiser left China on January 7th, 1946, to arrive back home on the 28th. Those repairs would last into April 1946, when the cruiser could do sea trials on April 6th, after which St. Paul remained on the American side of the Pacific for some time, sailing between Hawaii and the West Coast in May, then mooring in California through to August. Another short overhaul followed before St. Paul moved to Long Beach in late October, in this case for Navy Day celebrations. All of this and further training into November kept the ship close to home through all of 1946. In fact, she only returned to China in March 1947, where the cruiser would remain, aside from short stints in Japan, through to November, at which point she returned home for more refit, and in addition to that, more training duty, including training naval reservists in April and May of 1948. All told, pretty uneventful work, and that would be the pattern through the rest of the 1940s, either training off the West Coast or serving on patrol duty in China and Japan, with the most noteworthy event probably being a refit to operate the new helicopters in 1949. Although, then again, at least Saint Paul remained in service. You can't say the same for a lot of ships during this period. And because she was still in active, if admittedly quiet duty, St. Paul could quickly be sent off to Korea in 1950. The cruiser was operating off California on midshipman training in June of that year, when the North's invasion of South Korea gave the cruiser a second chance at combat duty. Though, second verse, same as the first. Her duty off Korea would be the same thing she had done in the Pacific War, covering carriers and shooting up shore targets, with this beginning in late July in the form of escorting carriers on patrol in the Taiwan Strait, to keep an eye out and make sure the People's Republic of China didn't take advantage of the chaos in Korea to invade Taiwan. That duty lasted from August through the end of October 1950. When it was apparent this wasn't going to happen, the cruiser shifted to Korea in November. At first for more carrier escort duty starting on November 9th. Then on November 17th, St. Paul was able to fire her guns in anger once more, when she shelled North Korean positions in support of UN forces advancing towards Chongjin, a mission that proved a bit more eventful than the crew might have expected. North Korean return fire came surprisingly close to hitting St. Paul. One shell sent shrapnel towards the cruiser, injuring 6 of the crew. Presumably annoyed return fire promptly destroyed the North Korean position, but still, that was more damage than the Japanese had managed. Still, it wasn't exactly going to take her off station. St. Paul continued to support land forces into the end of the year, including when Chinese forces joined the fray in November, with the cruiser supporting, in particular, the South Korean First Corps as they retreated down the coast. Then on December 2nd, she conducted harassing night missions against the Chinese positions, with a detour on the 3rd to enter Wonsan Harbor and fire against encroaching Chinese forces, then covering the evacuation of the port of Hungnam from December 10th to the 24th, during which the ship would fire from one side while taking on ammunition from the other, over 3,000 8-inch rounds during just 1 week of this. She would be the final ship to leave the harbor. As 1950 shifted to 1951, St. Paul would continue the bombardment duty. Without a need to worry about air attack, the only counters from the Chinese and the North Koreans were shore batteries, which tried to hit the cruiser on January 26, 1951, without effect. St. Paul, meanwhile, would help raids on rail lines by the Royal Marines on April 7th. After this, the cruiser, by now a bit worn out, was sent home. She left Korea, returning to San Francisco in June of 1951, where St. Paul would remain through to November, either for refit, this lasted to September, or post-refit workup. It was only on November 27th that she returned to Korea, where St. Paul continued to provide excellent, reliable gunfire support through the end of the year, and indeed into 1952. Aside from a detour to holiday in Japan, because everyone needs a break sometime. That break was short, and she was right back to Korea in early 1952. This should have been fairly uneventful as shore bombardments go, and it was at first. However, in April of 1952, St. Paul would suffer the worst damage of her entire career. self-inflicted damage at that. You see, on April 21st, the cruiser was firing on shore targets, when a serious powder fire broke out in the forward turret, a fire that originated from a premature detonation in the turret's left gun that had been loaded, but the breech was open. Somehow the gun captain thought it had fired and, well, ordered another shell rammed in. This blew up the gun and set off 2 other powder bags still in the hoist. 30 men would be lost as a result of the explosion and fire. Yet despite this, Saint Paul remained off Korea for more gunnery support. And on top of this, she managed to capture 9 North Korean soldiers from a small boat during those 2 weeks of damage support. As it would turn out, she only sailed for repairs in late May, arriving back home in California on June 24th, where she would remain for the rest of 1952. It was only in March 1953 that Saint Paul returned to Korea for a 3rd tour of duty, which would be less eventful, though she did serve alongside USS New Jersey at points, and was fired upon by shore batteries again, with some near misses getting as close as 10 yards away, with the most eventful moment coming on July 11th when St. Paul was hit directly. This was more of a consolation prize for the gunners ashore. It did minimal damage to a 3-inch anti-aircraft mount and didn't even injure any of the crew. A final attempt to stop the Fighting Saints before she did her final bombardment mission on July 27, 1953. Once more, there's reference to St. Paul firing the last shot from sea during the Korean War, an autographed shell by Rear Admiral Harry Sanders. With the Korean War coming to an uneasy end, however, St. Paul was off combat duty. She returned to peacetime work, bouncing between the West Coast and her old Japanese patrol duty, with a side of intimidating the Communist Chinese from November 19, 1954 to July 12, 1955. They had been making moves toward islands under control of the Republic of China. St. Paul joined other American ships in the 7th Fleet patrolling in Japanese and Chinese waters to protect American interests as well as Taiwan. Other than this, however, there wasn't much of note for the remainder of the 1950s, mostly refits and training duty. Although St. Paul would spend a surprising amount of time on flagship work, either of the 7th Fleet or, for short periods, the 1st Fleet. The most notable thing, really, was being home-ported out of Japan for 39 months, from 1959 through 1962. That said, in 1963, things would change up a little bit, not from conflict, but from her stint as a movie star. Like her successor, Salem, during the filming of the Battle of the River Plate. Both cruisers were used in films to represent other warships. Salem moonlighted as Graf Spee. St. Paul was used for In Harm's Way, a 1965 John Wayne film, where she was called Old Swayback, a clear reference to Salt Lake City or Swayback Maru. When that quote-unquote duty was done, St. Paul took up flagship duty for 1st Fleet, at least until 1966, at which point she returned to Asia and specifically to Vietnam. St. Paul would conduct 5 deployments off the Vietnamese coast, joining her sister Canberra in providing effective and accurate fire support. When a battleship wasn't available and destroyers weren't enough, you called on those cruisers. With Saint Paul hit by another shell on September 1st, 1967. None of the crew was hurt, and the damage was repaired on station, allowing Saint Paul to remain off Vietnam and continue firing ashore, something she would do for the rest of the 1960s, including one particularly noteworthy event in 1970, when the cruiser was equipped with long-range bombardment ammunition, special 8-inch shells, which, as the name suggests, extended the ship's range to, in this case, 35 miles or 56 kilometers, making the 6 structures she wrecked some of the longest range gunfire in history. However, shortly after this, the cruiser was taken off active duty. The veteran old ship, pretty thoroughly worn out by this point, was finally decommissioned, specifically on April 30th, 1971, though she was back home in December of 1970. USS Saint Paul would be put in reserve and ultimately scrapped in early 1980, after earning 1 battle star in the Pacific War, 8 in Korea, and a further 8 in Vietnam, 17 in all. Not a bad record by any means. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.